Caroline James signed her name on the marriage certificate with the same hand she'd used that morning to dig her father's grave marker into frozen ground, and she did not shake, and she did not cry. And when Reverend Albright looked up at her with that careful expression men wore when they expected a woman to fall apart, she looked straight back at him and said, "Is it legal now?" He said it was. She folded her copy, put it in her coat pocket, and walked out of that parlor without once looking at the man she'd just married. They had never held hands. They had never had a meal together. 3 days ago, she hadn't even known his first name. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever had to hold yourself together when everything inside you was already gone, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and follow this story all the way through to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happened next between Caroline James and Robert Mason in Ridgeback, Wyoming, is not a love story anyone planned, and that is exactly why it became one. The funeral was on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, Caroline was at the bank. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten anything she could remember. She had sat at her father's desk through the entire night with his ledgers open in front of her, going through every number twice, then a third time, as though the arithmetic might change if she looked at it long enough. It didn't. $412. 30 days. One signature line on a loan extension form that required a man's name because Wyoming law in the year of our Lord 1883 still operated on the assumption that a woman alone was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be dealt with. She got dressed before sunrise. She braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, tight and practical, nothing loose. She put on the dress she wore when she needed people to take her seriously dark blue good fabric, nothing that invited pity. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand, and she said out loud to her own reflection, "You are not going to lose this ranch." Then she drove the wagon into Ridgeback and walked into Harlan Briggs's office and sat down across from him before he'd finished his morning coffee. Briggs was the kind of man who had never once in his life been told he wasn't the most important person in a room, and it showed in everything: the way he arranged the items on his desk, the way he let silences stretch to demonstrate that his time was more valuable than yours, the way he looked at her now with an expression that was technically sympathetic and was actually just waiting for her to accept the inevitable. "Miss James," he said, "first let me say how sorry I am about your father. Amos was a fine man." "He was," she said. "I'd like to discuss the loan extension." Briggs set down his coffee cup. "Of course, though I have to be honest with you, the situation is somewhat complicated. $412 in 30 days. I understand the situation. It's not the amount, Miss James, it's the structure of the note." He opened his desk drawer and removed a folder she recognized she'd seen her father bring home papers from that same folder years ago. "The loan was issued under your father's name, with the ranch's collateral. To extend the term, we'd require either full repayment or a qualified co-signer on the revised note. I'm prepared to sign. A male co-signer," Briggs said, and he had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable when he said it, which was the only decent thing about the conversation. "It's policy, Miss James. The bank's charter requires—" "I've been running that ranch for 2 years." She kept her voice level. She had decided on the drive into town that she would not raise her voice, would not let her hands move, would not give this man a single thing to dismiss. "While my father was sick, I managed the cattle operation, the hay contracts, the water agreements with the Halverson property. Every payment on that note for the last 24 months came from work I did with my own hands." "I don't doubt that." "Then look at the payment record and tell me what risk the bank is actually carrying." Briggs opened the folder. He looked at the payment record. He closed the folder. "Miss James, I understand your frustration. I'm not frustrated." She stood. She picked up her gloves from the desk. "I'm informing you that I will return within the week with a co-signer. At that point, I expect the extension to be processed without further delay." She walked out. She got back in the wagon. She picked up the reins. She sat there for a long moment in the cold morning air, both horses patient and still in front of her. and she allowed herself exactly one breath. One long, slow breath through her nose and out through her mouth, and then she started driving. She knew with a clarity that surprised her by how calm it was that there were perhaps 4 men in Ridgeback who might agree to co-sign a loan for a woman they weren't related to. She had mentally eliminated 3 of them before she reached the edge of town. Doyle Packard would want something in return that she wasn't willing to give. Frank Ellery was sympathetic, but his own finances were shaky enough that the bank wouldn't accept him. Tom Garrett had already made 2 comments at the funeral about what a shame it was that Amos hadn't left a son behind, and she would deed the ranch to the county before she put her name next to his on anything. That left Robert Mason. She didn't know him well. Nobody in Ridgeback knew him well, which was, she thought, either a warning or a recommendation, depending on the kind of person you were. He had come to the valley 6 years ago from somewhere east. Some said Ohio. Some said further. He ran his spread efficiently. He kept his fences straight and his debts paid and his opinions to himself. He came to church at Christmas and Easter, and otherwise seemed to regard organized religion and organized society with roughly equal levels of polite disinterest. There were stories about him the way there were always stories about quiet men. She didn't listen to stories. She listened to payment records and fence lines and whether a man's handshake was straight. From what she could see across 4 miles and 6 years of distant observation, Robert Mason was a man who did what he said he would do and expected others to do the same. That was enough. It had to be. She turned the wagon east and drove 4 miles into the ridge country and arrived at his property just before 9 in the morning to find him at the near fence line, not repairing it, just standing with one forearm resting on the top rail, looking south with that quality of stillness that some men develop, and most never do, the kind that isn't inaction but is actually a form of very controlled attention. He heard her coming and turned when she pulled up. He was taller than she'd registered in town. His face was the kind that had been weathered into honesty not handsome in any careful way, but the kind of face you believed when it told you something, because it didn't appear capable of the energy required to lie. "Mr. Mason," she said. "Miss James." A pause. "Heard about your father. I'm sorry. Thank you." She didn't let the words land anywhere soft. "I'm here because I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate you hearing me out before you answer." "All right." He turned fully to face her, hands at his sides. No impatience. She told him everything. She told it straight. No decoration. The way she'd have explained a broken axle or a failed well. "This is the problem. This is what's required. This is what I'm proposing." The note, the policy, the 30 days. A legal marriage on paper only, his name beside hers on the extension. Separate homes, separate lives. Public appearances as needed. A quiet dissolution once the note was paid in full. When she finished, the silence between them was long enough that a hawk crossed the whole width of the south pasture overhead. "Why me?" he said. "Because you're the only man in this valley whose name on a document means something, and who I believe won't use this arrangement to take something I'm not offering." He looked at her for a moment, not the way men usually looked at her, assessing or calculating or pitying. More like he was reading something and wanted to make sure he'd read it right. "I won't be lied to," he said. "If there's trouble with the ranch or the arrangement or anything else, you come to me straight. I don't want to be handled." "Agreed, and I expect the same. I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning. I appreciate that." She gathered the reins. "Mr. Mason, I want you to understand, I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm not asking it lightly." "I know," he said quietly. "You wouldn't be here if you were." She rode home, and she did not let herself think about the answer until she was back inside her father's house, standing in the kitchen, where everything still smelled faintly like him. Like wood smoke and the particular soap he'd used for 40 years, and something that was just him, irreplaceable and already fading. She put both hands on the edge of the kitchen table and stood there. Then she went to his desk and opened the ledger and ran her fingers down the last page he'd written in his own hand. The date was 6 weeks ago. His writing was careful and slightly slanted, every number checked, every entry exact. He'd been proud of these books, proud that every acre of willow pine had a purpose, and every dollar that came in or went out was accounted for with honesty. She turned to the last entry, then passed it to the blank pages she'd been filling in since he couldn't. Her handwriting wasn't like his. Hers was smaller, more compressed, the writing of someone who had learned to take up less space. She had tried in those 6 weeks to match his exactness. She wasn't sure she'd managed it. She pressed her palm flat against the page. "I'm not going to lose it," she said to the empty kitchen. To him, wherever he was. "I don't care what I have to do. I'm not going to let them take what you built." The house didn't answer. Houses never did. But she felt in the particular silence of a place that had held someone you loved for a long time, something that was not comfort exactly, but was close enough to it to let her breathe. She stayed at that desk until midnight. When she finally went to bed, she lay on top of the quilt with her boots still on, staring at the ceiling, and she did not cry. Not because she didn't need to, but because she was afraid if she started, she would not be able to stop, and she needed to be able to function in the morning. That was the kind of strong nobody saw. The kind that cost everything and looked like nothing from the outside. Mason arrived before 7. She was splitting wood when she heard hooves, and she set the axe down and walked to meet him. He stepped down from his horse and stood holding the reins and looked at her with that straight reading expression. "I'll do it," he said. Something released in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like a knot that had been pulled so tight for so long that the loosening of it hurt almost as much as the tension had. "All right," she said, "but I want to be clear." "Go ahead. This stays what it is. A legal arrangement between two adults who understand the terms." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to interfere in how you run your operation, and I'm not going to pretend to feelings I don't have. I won't put on a performance for this town. Neither will I. We'll be seen together when it's necessary and separate the rest of the time." "Agreed." A pause. "And Caroline." It was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed differently than she expected. "I'm sorry you were put in a corner like this. You shouldn't have been." She looked at him. No pity in his voice, no condescension. Just a plain statement of a plain injustice, offered without any expectation that it would make her feel better, which somehow made it the most honest thing anyone had said to her since her father died. "No," she said. "I shouldn't have been. I'll come to town Thursday for the Reverend. I'll be ready." He put his boot in the stirrup. "Is there anything you need before then?" She almost said no automatically. The word was already formed, already halfway out, because saying no was what she had learned to do, what every woman in her position learned to do, because needing things was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a door that swung both ways. But she stopped herself. She looked at this man who had just agreed to put his name on her debt for no personal gain she could identify, and she thought about what her father used to say, that the only thing more foolish than asking for help you didn't need was refusing help you did. "No," she said. "I think we're all right for now." She watched him go, and stood there in the cold, turning that almost over in her mind. Almost honest, almost willing. That was where she was living right now, in the half-inch between what was true and what she was prepared to say out loud. The wedding was on a Tuesday. Reverend Albright's front parlor. His wife and the church secretary as witnesses. Caroline wore her good dress, the gray-green one saved for serious occasions. Mason wore a jacket that fit well enough to tell her it was his good one too. He smelled like pine soap. He stood beside her at exactly the right distance, close enough for propriety, far enough for honesty. Albright read the words. Mason said his in a voice that was low and did not waver. Caroline said hers clearly the way she read a contract. Not cold, precise. There was a difference. When Albright reached the end of the ceremony and began, "You may now," Mason extended his hand to shake. Albright blinked, shook it, looked confused. Caroline allowed herself one precise internal moment of appreciation for that. At the bank, Briggs watched Mason walk in beside her and became in the space of about 90 seconds a completely different man. The condescension evaporated. The careful sympathy disappeared. What replaced it was the simple business-like attention he would have shown any male property owner who walked through his door, which was, Caroline thought, all she had ever been asking for in the first place. The note was extended. The papers were signed. Outside on the boardwalk, Mason put his hat back on. "That's done?" he said. "Yes." She held the signed papers against her side. "Robert." She tried the name. It didn't feel wrong, which she noted. "Thank you." He looked at her steadily. "You'd have found another way." Maybe this was faster. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, almost the shape of one. "I'll be at my place if you need anything," he said. He touched his hat brim and walked to his horse. She watched him go and told herself firmly and clearly that this was a legal arrangement between two adults who had understood the terms from the beginning, and that the slight warmth she felt in her chest watching him walk away was nothing more than relief and gratitude, and the ordinary human response to someone helping you when you were drowning. She believed that almost entirely. The week settled. Ridgeback talked naturally because a widow's daughter marrying a near stranger 3 days after her father's funeral was not a story this town was going to leave alone. She heard the versions. Grief marriage. She panicked. He must have wanted the land. She let them pass the way you let weather pass, acknowledging it without arguing with it, because you can't argue with weather. Mason was at his ranch. She was at hers. They did not call on each other. They did not correspond. When she saw him twice in town in those first weeks, he touched his hat and she nodded, and that was the whole of it. It was 4 weeks in on a Thursday evening when everything shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way the stories say things shift. No lightning, no declaration, no door thrown open in the rain. It shifted the way ground shifts in early spring, when the freeze loosens so gradually you don't notice until you step somewhere you thought was solid, and find it has given a little beneath your weight. She was at the water pump behind the main barn, fighting it. Handle seized rust in the collar or something broken deeper in the mechanism, and she'd been at it for 20 minutes past the point where she should have walked away. She heard hooves and turned to find Mason dismounting at the hitching post with the easy authority of someone who belonged where he was. "What's wrong with it?" he said, crossing to her. "Seized up. Collar, I think." He crouched and looked without touching, studying the resistance points, the way she'd noticed he approached everything reading before committing. Then he put his hand on the collar and tested it. "It's the rod," he said. "I've got a spare coupling that fits this style. I'll bring it tomorrow." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He stood and looked at her directly. "You planning to carry water from the creek while you wait on the blacksmith? I was going to figure something out. This is faster." He held her gaze. "Unless you've got a reason to say no." She didn't have one. Not a real one. "Fine," she said. "I'll have coffee ready." He was back before 7 the next morning with the coupling in his saddlebag. He had the pump working inside 50 minutes. He didn't ask her for help and didn't exclude her either. Just held out his hand for tools when he needed them, and she passed them without being asked twice. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that meant two people were doing something together, and neither one felt the need to fill the air with sound to prove they were present. When the water ran clean and cold, she brought out 2 mugs. He took the coffee without hesitation, wrapped both hands around the mug, looked at the mountains to the north. "You do most of the maintenance yourself?" he asked. "All of it the last 2 years. Papa taught me. Said there was no point owning land you couldn't keep." He was right. He usually was. She looked into her mug. "He would have liked you, I think." He didn't have much patience for men who said more than they meant. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then, "What was he like when he was well?" The question surprised her. Not because it was strange, because it was kind, and she hadn't been prepared for kindness in that particular form. People had told her they were sorry for her loss approximately 40 times in the last month. Exactly nobody had asked what he was like. Stubborn, she said. Impossibly stubborn. He had a way of deciding a thing and then just being immovable about it. like a post you've set in concrete. She paused. He also laughed at his own jokes before he'd finished telling them. Every single time. He couldn't help it. She felt the corners of her own mouth pull. It drove me half crazy when I was young. I'd give a lot to hear it now. Mason looked at her. Not with pity. Something quieter than pity and more respectful. He sounds like a man worth missing, he said. He was, she said. He really was. They stood there for a moment in the morning light, with their coffee, not speaking, and it was the easiest silence she had been in since before her father died. She became aware of it, the ease of it, and then became aware that she'd become aware of it, and that second awareness was warning enough. You don't have to keep coming out here, she said. Not unkindly, carefully. I know that. He looked at her over the rim of his mug. Are you asking me not to? She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was no. She was not asking him not to. No, she said. He nodded as though that settled something and finished his coffee. He came back 2 weeks later in the evening, which she hadn't expected. She was at the kitchen table with the week's accounts when she heard boots on the porch, that particular knock that was neither hesitant nor demanding, and she opened the door to find him holding a brown paper parcel. I was in town, he said. Mercantile had dried apples at a fair price, bought enough for 2 houses. She stared at the parcel. I ate one on the way back, he said, which landed somewhere between confession and the driest possible version of humor. And it was so unexpected that she laughed, actually laughed. A short, surprised sound she hadn't made in weeks. He looked slightly startled. Then something in his face relaxed very carefully, like a man who wasn't used to that happening and was trying to decide how he felt about it. Come in, she said. There's coffee. He sat at her father's table, and she put the apples away and poured coffee, and they talked. Not the careful exchange of necessary information they'd managed so far, but actual conversation, the kind with pauses and tangents and moments where one thing led to another. And you looked up and an hour had gone by. He told her about a dispute with his hay supplier, a man in Cheyenne, who'd shorted him on a winter order and then tried to argue the weight count. His jaw had tightened when he described it, that flat, controlled anger of a man who can tolerate a great many things, but cannot tolerate being treated dishonestly. What did you do? She asked. Wrote him a letter, Mason said. 3 sentences. Told him the correct weight, the contracted amount, and what I intended to do if the difference wasn't made good by the end of the month. And difference was made good in 2 weeks. 3 sentences, she said. Didn't need 4. She looked at him. Most men would have ridden to Cheyenne. Most men would have wasted 3 days and a horse. He picked up his coffee. I had hay to move. She told him about the calf born that morning. Sideways, 2 hours of hard work in the cold before it finally came out, and now standing in her barn with its legs planted in 4 directions and an expression of magnificent resentment at having been born at all. What'd you name it? He asked. I don't name the ones I'm going to sell. You're going to sell that one? She paused. Probably not, she admitted. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the honest shape of one like a door that had been shut a long time, opening a 1/4 inch toward the light. She noticed it. She filed it away somewhere. She told herself she wasn't keeping a file. When he stood to go, it was full dark outside, later than either of them had planned. At the door, he stopped and turned back, and he looked at her in that direct reading way. You've built something real out here, Caroline, he said. What you've kept running, that's not small work. Your father knew that. She felt the words land somewhere deep and undefended. She hadn't been expecting them. She hadn't known she needed to hear them until she was already hearing them. Thank you, she said, quietly. I mean it. His eyes held hers for one moment, steady and clear and carrying something she couldn't quite name. Good night. He walked out into the dark. She stood at the door and listened to his horse carry him east down the road, and she pressed her forehead against the doorframe and closed her eyes and stood there for a long count of 10 breaths. The arrangement had been simple, legal, practical. Two adults with a clear understanding of what it was and what it wasn't. She had believed in that simplicity with her whole mind. But her whole mind, it turned out, was not entirely in agreement with the part of her that had laughed at a man's dry remark about dried apples, or the part that had answered honestly when he asked if she wanted him to stop coming out, or the part that still felt the warmth of his words about her father sitting in her chest like something that had decided to stay. She went back inside. She sat at the desk. She opened the ledger. The numbers were the same as they'd been before, but something had shifted. Quietly, without announcement. The way the truest changes always come, not as declarations, but as the slow, certain movement of something that has already decided where it's going. Out on the road east of town, Robert Mason rode home through the dark and kept his eyes on the trail, and did not let himself think about the sound of her laugh, that short, startled, genuine sound, or the way she'd looked when he said what he'd said about her father, like someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time, and had not realized until that moment how much it weighed. He had agreed to a legal arrangement. He had shaken a reverend's hand and signed a bank document, and meant every word of the terms, meant them completely with the full force of a man who kept his word as a matter of personal survival. He had also brought dried apples to a woman's kitchen and sat at her table for 2 hours and ridden home later than he intended. Feeling something he had not felt in so long, he had almost convinced himself it was gone permanently. He had been wrong about that. He told himself it was nothing. He was practiced at telling himself things were nothing. He told himself it twice before the lights of his place came into view, and the third time he didn't bother, because some things, once you've named them to yourself, refuse to go back to being unnamed. In Ridgeback, Wyoming, nothing stayed hidden forever. But some things took their time rising to the surface. And what was growing between these two people, in the space between a water pump and a kitchen table, and a road traveled twice in the dark, was still underground, still quiet, still covered by the careful terms of an agreement that neither of them had intended to mean anything. Both of them were beginning to understand that intention, when it came to certain things, did not have the final say. The morning after Mason rode home in the dark, Caroline woke before sunrise and told herself 3 things in the following order: that she had a ranch to run, that she had a note to pay, and that whatever had shifted in her chest the night before was irrelevant to both of those facts. She believed the first 2 completely. She got up, built the fire, put the coffee on, and went out to check on the calf. It was standing in the same 4 directions at once posture it had adopted at birth regarding her arrival, with an expression of profound personal offense. She checked its legs, checked its breathing, made sure it had nursed through the night. It had. It was healthy and indignant, and she had already, she realized, named it in her head, not out loud, not officially, but in the private accounting she kept of things she intended to keep. She called it contrary. It suited. She fed the horses, checked the fence line on the east pasture, came back in, and ate standing at the counter, because sitting down felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet, and she was back at the ledger by 7:30 with her coffee and a list of everything that needed doing before the week was out. She did not think about Mason. She thought about Mason constantly, not in the soft, unfocused way of a woman entertaining feelings she'd chosen to entertain. More like the way you're aware of a sound you can't identify, present at the edge of every thought, refusing to be categorized, demanding more attention than she was willing to give it. She put her pencil down. She picked it up again. She wrote 2 numbers and crossed them out and wrote them again correctly. This was a legal arrangement. She had been desperate, and he had been willing, and he had been kind, and kindness under those circumstances was not a thing to build anything on. Men were kind to women. They felt sorry for all the time. That was not the same as anything else. She told herself that. She told herself that again on Tuesday, when she saw him from across the street in town, and he raised his hand in greeting, and she raised hers back. And something in her chest did what it had been doing since the water pump conversation. Which was the problem, which was the entire problem. The thing she had not accounted for in the practical architecture of this arrangement was him. Not his name on a document or his presence at a bank counter. Him, the specific inconvenient reality of a man who didn't say more than he meant and didn't do more than he intended and showed up anyway with dried apples and a spare pump coupling and 2 hours of the most comfortable silence she'd experienced since her father died. She had not accounted for that. She should have. It was the third week of their arrangement when the barn hinge broke. It was the big door on the north side, the one that had been stiff all winter, that she'd been meaning to replace since January, and hadn't because there was always something more urgent. The pin finally gave on a Tuesday morning when she was moving hay, and the door swung wild and caught her across the left forearm hard enough to leave a bruise the full width of the door's edge. She didn't make a sound. She stepped back, held her arm against her side, breathed through it, and assessed. Not broken, she'd broken bones before, and knew the difference. Bruised deep and going to stiffen, but functional. She finished moving the hay with her right arm doing most of the work and propped the door with a fence post and added replace hinge pin to the list she kept on the back page of the ledger. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't tell Mason. She didn't tell Mason specifically because telling him felt like crossing a line she'd established for herself, the line between the practical and the personal, between a man whose name was on her loan documents and a man whose judgment she was beginning to trust in a way that had nothing to do with legal paperwork. He found out 3 days later. He came out on Friday. She hadn't asked him. He simply appeared the way he'd begun to appear when something needed doing, as though he had a sense for it. She couldn't explain, and when she came around the corner of the barn to meet him, he looked at her left arm, where the bruise had gone purple and yellow at the edges, and his jaw tightened in a way she'd learned to read as controlled concern. "The door," he said. She stopped. "How did you—" "Your arm, and the post holding the north door." He looked at her directly. "When did it happen?" "Tuesday." "Tuesday." He said it once evenly, but there was something underneath it. Not anger at her, she understood immediately. Anger at the situation, at the fact that she'd been alone when it happened, at the specific helplessness of being 4 miles away from someone who'd gotten hurt. "You should have sent word." "It's not broken." "I can see that. You still should have sent word." She looked at him. "Robert, we agreed separate lives." "We agreed on separate homes," he said. "Not on you working with a door that could have taken your shoulder clean off without a single person knowing until you didn't show up somewhere." She opened her mouth, closed it. Because he wasn't wrong, and she knew he wasn't wrong, and the particular frustration of that was sharp and uncomfortable in a way she hadn't expected. "I'll fix the hinge today," he said. He didn't wait for her to agree. He went back to his horse and took tools from the saddlebag, and that was the end of the discussion, or at least his end of it. She stood there for the moment, watching him, feeling something she couldn't neatly categorize. It wasn't gratitude she was used to. Gratitude, it was clean and simple. This was something with more friction to it. Something that felt like what happened when you'd been carrying something alone for so long that you'd stopped noticing the weight, and then someone reached over and took part of it without asking permission, and the sudden lightness was so unfamiliar, it made you unsteady. "I was going to handle it," she said. "I know you were." He didn't look up from the hinge assembly. "That ain't the point." She didn't answer that. She got him coffee and held her arm carefully and watched him work and did not say what she was thinking, which was, "What is the point then? What exactly are you telling me, Robert Mason, with your spare couplings and your dried apples and your jaw that tightens when I've been hurt?" She didn't ask. She wasn't ready for the answer. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known from where she was standing, was that Mason had been up since 4 that morning. Not because of anything on his own property. Because in the week since he'd sat at her kitchen table and heard her laugh for the first time, he'd started sleeping lighter. Not badly. Just aware. The way you become aware of a sound that matters without knowing exactly when it started mattering. He'd gone over the list in his head of things on Willow Pine that she'd mentioned in passing. The barn door. The east pasture fence post that had shifted in the last hard freeze. The south gate latch that she'd said was giving her trouble, but not enough trouble to prioritize. He had gone over that list the way another man might go over his own accounts, the attentive, responsible cataloging of things that needed to be addressed before they became problems. He was aware that this was not strictly within the terms of their arrangement. He was also aware that he didn't particularly care. He fixed the hinge in 40 minutes. When he was done, he swung the door 3 times to test the movement, and then stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who had made a thing work correctly. "It'll hold," he said. "Thank you. I'm going to look at that east fence post before I go." "Robert." It shifted in the freeze. He looked at her steadily. "I'd sleep better knowing its sound." She held his gaze. He held hers. Neither of them looked away. "Fine," she said. Something in his expression shifted just slightly, just at the edges, that same almost movement she'd started cataloging without meaning to. He picked up his tools. She walked with him to the east pasture, not because he needed her to, but because she found herself unwilling to let the morning end yet, and she had stopped pretending not to know why. The post was worse than she'd thought. Mason crouched beside it, testing the ground compression, and looked up at her with an expression that said he'd been right to come without making any actual point of being right. "I'll need to reset it properly," he said. "It'll take a couple of hours. You want me to come back or—" "You're already here," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. They worked through the morning together, him doing the heavy labor of pulling the post and resetting the depth, her mixing the stabilizing compound and handing tools and testing the alignment with a level her father had owned for 30 years. They worked in the rhythm they'd developed without trying to develop it. No wasted motion, no unnecessary direction. Each of them reading what the other needed before it was said. Around mid-morning, she brought water, and they sat on the fence rail and drank it shoulder to shoulder, not quite touching, looking out across the pasture at where the cattle moved slowly through the brown winter grass. "My father used to do this," she said. "At the end of a good work morning, just sit and look at it." Look at what? At what he'd done. What was still standing because he'd worked to keep it standing. She turned the tin cup in her hands. "He said the land kept a record of everything you gave it, that it remembered." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I believe that," he said. "Do you?" "My grandfather had a place in Ohio, worked it for 60 years. He paused. The kind of pause she'd learned meant he was deciding how much to say, not because he was evasive, but because he was careful. "When he died, the land went to creditors. Some of it's railroad siding now." He drank his water. "But I can still remember what it looked like before." "I think he'd want someone to." She looked at his profile. It was the most he'd said about himself in one stretch since she'd met him, and she understood instinctively that it had not been easy for him to say, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they carried, which was a particular kind of grief. She recognized the grief of a thing lost that should not have been. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the automatic condolence, the real one. "Long time ago." He stood and put the cup down. "We should get that post set before the ground stiffens again." She stood too. They went back to work. But something had moved between them in that 10 minutes on the fence rail, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, and the not saying was as present as anything that had been said. Ridgeback began to notice around the 4th week. Not that there was anything obvious to notice. That was the thing about small towns, they didn't need obvious. They needed patterns repetition, the slight wrongness of something that should be routine, but isn't quite. Eliza Dunmore, at the dry goods counter, noticed that Mason had started buying coffee in the quantity of 2 households rather than 1. Reverend Albright's wife noticed that when Caroline came to Sunday service, and Mason came to Sunday service, they sat on the same side of the aisle for the first time. Hattie Grayson, who ran the boarding house and missed nothing that happened within 4 blocks of her porch, noticed that Mason's horse had been seen on the Willow Pine Road on 3 separate Fridays. None of this was evidence of anything. All of it was fuel. By the 5th week, there were 2 camps in Ridgeback regarding the Mason-James marriage. The first camp held that it was exactly what it appeared. A convenience arrangement, a desperate woman, and an indifferent man. Nothing more to it than paperwork. The second camp, smaller and more careful, held that something was happening out on that ranch that didn't quite fit the paperwork narrative, and they were watching. Caroline was aware of both camps. She conducted herself accordingly, civil, composed, unreadable when she needed to be. She had learned in 2 years of running a ranch as a woman alone that the best armor was competence. If you were too busy being good at your work to give people a drama, they eventually moved on to someone else's drama. It was on a Wednesday morning in the 6th week that she came into town for supplies and walked into the middle of something she hadn't expected. She was at the counter at Dunmore's Dry Goods when she heard the conversation from the corner booth. 2 ranchers she knew by sight. Older men, the kind who'd been in the valley since before she was born, and held their opinions like deeds permanent and non-negotiable. "That Mason place should have been sold years ago," said the first one, a man named Coates. "What's he running out there 50 head? My boy could turn that into a real operation." "Heard he turned down 3 offers," said the second. "Stubborn." A pause. "Though I suppose it don't matter now. That James woman's got him signing her paperwork, so might as well be one operation. Bank'll call it that eventually." "You think she'll hold the ranch?" Coates made a sound. "Alone. Not a chance. With Mason carrying her, maybe another year before she realizes she'd be better off selling and saving herself the grief." She turned from the counter. She turned slowly on purpose, so that when she was facing their direction, it didn't look like a reaction, but like a decision. "Good morning, Mr. Coates," she said clearly enough to carry the length of the store. "I couldn't help but hear you discussing my ranch. If you've got a specific question about Willow Pine's operation, I'm happy to answer it directly." Coates looked at her. His expression did the thing men's expressions did when they'd been caught saying something they believed absolutely and were now surprised to be held accountable for. "Miss James, Mrs. Mason," he corrected. "I wasn't—" "You were saying you don't think I'll hold it." She kept her voice level, conversational almost. "That's a specific prediction. I'm curious what it's based on." "Now, I didn't mean any disrespect. I have 43 head of cattle, Mr. Coates, 12 of which calved successfully this season, a hay contract with 2 buyers in Laramie, and a water agreement that's been in continuous good standing for 11 years. The loan on my property has not missed a payment in all the time it's been held." She picked up her basket. "I appreciate your concern for Willow Pine's future. I'll be sure to let you know when I need your assessment." She paid for her supplies and walked out. She was at the wagon hands gripping the side rail harder than necessary when she heard boots on the boards behind her. She turned, expecting Coates. It was Mason. He'd come around the corner of the feed store, which meant he'd been on the street, which meant he had almost certainly heard most of what had just happened. He looked at her with that steady reading expression. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He waited. "No?" she said more quietly. "Not entirely." He nodded. He stepped closer, not all the way, not enough to make a public statement, but enough to be deliberate. "What Coates said, it isn't what people think. Some of it is. The people who know what a ranch actually takes don't think it. The ones who talk the loudest are the ones who've never built a thing that had to last a winter." He looked at her directly. "You know that." She did know that. She knew it the way she knew things she'd learned from her father, bone deep, not requiring proof. Knowing it and hearing it said out loud in someone else's voice are 2 different things, she said. "Yes," he said. "They are." A pause. "You need anything from town, or are you heading back?" "Heading back." "I'll ride with you to the cutoff." She started to say she didn't need an escort. She stopped herself. Because he wasn't offering an escort, he was offering company, which was a different thing, and she was tired of refusing things she actually wanted on principle. "All right," she said. They rode out of Ridgeback side by side, and 3 people saw them, and 2 of them updated their opinions accordingly, and that was fine. Let them update. Let them look. Caroline James had stopped apologizing for things she hadn't done wrong, and she wasn't going to start again now. At the cutoff, Mason pulled up. "You handled that well," he said. "I handled it the only way I know how. That's usually the best way." He looked at her for a moment. "Caroline." "Yes. Don't let people like Coates make you doubt what you're doing. Not for a second." His voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something with weight. "You're keeping that ranch alive on your own work and your own judgment. Don't let someone who's never done half of it tell you what it's worth." She felt the words settle in her chest, the way his words had been settling lately, deep and without asking permission. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." He touched his hat. "I'll see you Friday." He turned back toward the East Road, and she watched him go, and she thought he said, "Friday." Not "I might be out Friday," or "if there's anything that needs doing." He said, "I'll see you Friday," the way you say something you've already decided on. She rode home and turned that over in her mind the entire 4 miles. And by the time she pulled up to the barn, she had decided she was not going to be reasonable about it anymore. She was not going to pretend she hadn't been looking forward to Fridays for the last 3 weeks. She was not going to pretend that the sound of hooves on her road had stopped making her straighten up and listen the way she did when she heard something that mattered. She had already been in this situation for at least a week without admitting it. The least she could do was admit it to herself. She put the horses up and went inside and made supper and ate it with contrary, watching from the barn door with that permanent expression of injured dignity, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt something that was not grief and not fear, and not the grinding exhaustion of holding everything together by force of will alone. She felt cautiously, and without letting it get too large, something like all right. She sat with that for a while. She let it stay. What she didn't know was that in the same hour, 4 miles east, Mason was at his own kitchen table with his accounts open and untouched in front of him, thinking about the way she'd turned to face Coates in that store, slowly, deliberately, like a woman who had decided to stop being patient about something. He'd been coming around the corner of the feed store when he heard her voice, and he'd stopped and he'd listened, and what he'd felt listening was something he hadn't felt in years and had not expected to feel again. It wasn't admiration exactly, though it was that. It was something more specific. The particular response of a man who has spent a long time believing that the world contains very few people worth paying close attention to, and who has just received further evidence that he was right to pay attention to this one. He told himself he was going to be careful. He'd been telling himself that since the water pump, since the kitchen table, since the fence rail and the conversation about his grandfather's land, which he had not spoken about to anyone in 6 years, and had somehow found himself saying to this woman in the middle of a work morning, as though it were the most natural thing. He was being careful. He was being extremely careful. He was going out to her property on Fridays and showing up when things broke and buying coffee in the quantity of 2 households, and he was being so careful. It was almost impressive, he thought dryly, given how completely it wasn't working. The 7th week brought rain, a hard, sustained 3-day rain that turned the roads to mud and made outdoor work nearly impossible. She did what could be done indoors. Mended tack worked. The account started a letter to her hay buyer in Laramie about the spring contract terms. On the 2nd day of rain in the afternoon, she heard hooves. She put down the tack and went to the door and opened it before he could knock. He was standing on the porch with water running off his hat brim and a look on his face that said he was aware this was not strictly a necessity-based visit and had decided to come anyway. "It's raining," she said. "I noticed." "You rode 4 miles in this. The road's passable." He pulled his hat off, shook the water from the brim. "I brought your ledger copy from the bank. They sent the note confirmation. I told them to mail it to my address since we were in town together when we filed. Didn't think to mention it until now." She looked at the envelope he was holding out. She took it. She knew, and he knew, that this could have waited until the rain stopped. It could have waited until Friday. It could have been sent with someone else entirely. "Come inside," she said. He came inside. She made coffee. She was always making coffee now, and he was always accepting it, and neither of them commented on what a normal and domestic ritual this had quietly become. And she opened the bank confirmation and read it, while he stood at the window, looking at the rain, the way he looked at most things with his full attention. "It's all in order," she said. "I know. I read it before I brought it." "Of course you did." She folded it. "Thank you. You're welcome." He turned from the window. "How are the cattle handling the rain?" "Fine. I moved the younger ones into the lower barn yesterday morning." "Smart. The runoff in that east pasture gets bad by the third day." "I know. Papa showed me the drainage pattern the first winter I helped him work it." She set the letter down on the desk. "Robert, why did you really ride out here today?" The question landed in the room like something dropped, not hostile, not accusatory, just clear. She'd reached the point without entirely deciding to reach it where she didn't want to dance around the edges of things anymore. She was too tired, and it was raining, and he was standing in her kitchen for the second time in 3 weeks, for reasons that had stopped being about bank documents. He looked at her. He didn't answer immediately, which she'd learned to read as honesty and preparation rather than evasion. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said finally. After Coates, after what he said. "It was 3 days ago." "I know. I told you I was fine. You told me you weren't entirely fine. And then we rode to the cutoff and I went home and I've been—" He stopped. His jaw set slightly, that controlled quality. He had the one that kept everything measured. "I should have said something more useful at the cutoff than I did. I've been thinking about what would have been more useful." She stared at him. "You rode 4 miles in the rain because you thought of something better to say to me 3 days ago." "That's one way to put it." "Robert." "Yes." "What did you want to say?" He looked at her steadily. The rain hit the roof. The fire settled. Contrary made a sound from the direction of the barn that was probably unrelated but felt somehow pointed. "That it shouldn't be this hard," he said. "Running a place like this alone, fighting for the right to keep what's yours, having men like Coates sit in dry goods stores, deciding what you're capable of without knowing a damn thing about what you actually do. That shouldn't be what your life costs you." His voice stayed quiet, but there was something underneath it, something she could feel the edge of, like heat from a fire that's further away than you thought. "Your father built something worth keeping. And you've kept it. That matters. What those men think about it doesn't." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain outside, the warmth of the fire. This man who had ridden 4 miles in bad weather to finish a conversation he hadn't started well, and who looked slightly uncomfortable, now, not because he regretted what he'd said, but because he was a man who didn't talk about what he felt with any frequency, and he'd just done it twice in 3 days. "It matters that you said that," she said, carefully, honestly. He nodded. "Will you stay for supper?" she said. Something in him went very still for a half-second. Then, "If you've got enough." "I've always got enough." He stayed. They ate. She'd made a stew that had been on the stove since noon, and he ate 2 full portions without comment, but with a thoroughness that suggested he hadn't eaten anything since morning. They talked about the spring cattle plans, about the fence line on the north property, about a rumor she'd heard that the railroad was expanding its route options further west. He had thoughts on all of it, measured practical thoughts, the kind that came from someone who'd been paying attention for a long time and had drawn careful conclusions. After supper he helped her clear the table, which she had not expected. He did it without ceremony, without making a point of it, the way he did most things, as though it were simply the next logical action, and the only interesting thing about it was that someone might think it required comment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't." He stacked the plates. "Do you have to tell me I don't have to every time I do something?" She felt it, that small, surprised warmth in her chest. "Probably not," she admitted. "Then we're making progress," he said, and it was dry, and it was quiet, and it was exactly his particular version of humor. And she felt herself go still for a moment, in the same way he'd gone still at the supper invitation, as though something had happened that required a breath before the next thing. He left when the rain eased, just after 8. At the door he paused with his hat in his hand, and looked at her with that reading expression that she'd begun to understand was how he gave his full attention to something he was trying to understand correctly. "I'll be out Friday," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for one more second, something in his eyes that was careful and clear, and carrying more than either of them had officially agreed to be carrying. Then he put his hat on and walked out into the wet dark, and she closed the door behind him and stood in the warmth of her kitchen for a long time, not moving, not thinking in any organized way, just feeling it, whatever it was, whatever it had become. Outside, the rain had softened to a low, steady sound against the roof, and the ground the kind of rain that sounded like something being laid down, something settling into place. Inside the house that her father had built, and she had kept, Caroline James pressed her back against the closed door and looked at the ceiling and understood with absolute clarity that the arrangement she had made 6 weeks ago, the clean, practical, carefully bounded arrangement, had already crossed into territory that had no map and no prior agreement. She wasn't afraid of that. Or rather, she was afraid of it, but not in the way she'd expected. Not the fear of losing something. The much stranger, harder fear of being given something she hadn't planned for. Something that once you took it in, you couldn't give back. 4 miles east. Mason rode home through the lightning rain and thought about the way she'd looked when she asked him why he'd really come. Not challenging, honest. The particular courage of a woman who had decided she was done pretending not to see what was in front of her. He thought about that the whole ride home. He thought about it as he put his horse up and went inside and built his fire and sat in the chair by the window that looked west toward Willow Pine. He was a man who had learned to be careful with the things he let matter. He had learned it the hard way, in the way that left marks you carried for years. He had built a life in Ridgeback that was sufficient and functional, and asked nothing of anyone, and gave nothing back that couldn't be replaced. He was aware, sitting in that chair, looking west, that what was happening with Caroline James was not going to be sufficient and functional. It was not going to ask nothing and give nothing back. It was going to ask everything. He sat with that for a long time. The fire, the dark, the soft sound of rain on a roof. Then he opened his own ledger, the one he kept of his ranch accounts, every number careful, and twice checked the way she'd described her father's, and he added a line. Not a number. Not an entry. Just her name. Then he closed the book and went to bed. In Ridgeback, something was shifting. Both of them could feel it 4 miles apart, lying in the dark, listening to the same rain on the same Wyoming night, thinking about a conversation that had officially been about a bank document and had actually been about nothing of the kind. Neither of them slept particularly well. Both of them thought in the long, quiet hours before dawn that they would need to decide soon what they were going to do about what this had become. Neither of them was quite ready. But the distance between them, the careful, contracted, deliberately maintained distance, had been closing for weeks. Quietly, without announcement. And somewhere in that long, rainy night, it crossed a threshold that neither of them had marked on any map. After that, there was no going back. He arrived on a Monday. Caroline didn't notice him at first. She was at the feed store settling an account when she heard his voice at the counter behind her, smooth, unhurried, the kind of voice that had been trained to sound like it belonged everywhere it went. She turned out of habit and saw a man she didn't recognize, well-dressed, by Ridgeback standards, hat-clean boots, polished in a way that said he hadn't walked anywhere unpaved recently. He was talking to old Mercer behind the counter with the easy familiarity of someone who had decided they were already on good terms with everyone in the room. She turned back to her own business, paid her account, picked up her receipt. When she turned to leave, he was looking at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, assessing her as a woman or dismissing her as a rancher. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided to acquire and is simply working out the timing. She walked past him and out the door and told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. His name was Decker Hale, and by Tuesday morning everyone in Ridgeback knew he was a land broker out of Denver, with connections to 3 different railway development offices and a reputation in the towns where he'd worked before for being extraordinarily patient and extraordinarily effective. She heard this from Hattie Grayson at the post office on Tuesday afternoon. Hattie had already assembled more information about Decker Hale in 24 hours than most people collected about their neighbors in a year. "He's staying at my boarding house," Hattie said, lowering her voice to the register she used for things she considered significant. "Asked me specifically about properties west of town. Said he was interested in the watershed corridor." She paused deliberately. "Willow Pine sits right in the middle of that corridor, Caroline." "I know where my ranch sits, Hattie. I'm just saying." Hattie slid her mail across the counter. "He's a careful man, the kind that doesn't make a move until he knows exactly what he's moving toward." Carolyn took her mail. "Thank you for telling me." She rode home, and she did not allow herself to be frightened, because fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She allowed herself to be alert, which was different. Alert meant you were paying attention. Fear meant the other person had already gotten inside your decision-making, and she wasn't going to let that happen. She was at the desk that evening going through the property documents her father had kept: the original deed, the water rights agreement, the grazing permits, when she heard Mason's horse on the road. It was Wednesday now, not Friday, and she heard herself exhale something she hadn't known she'd been holding. She opened the door before he reached the porch. He looked at her face. "What happened?" "A land broker came into town Monday. Name of Decker Hale. He's out of Denver and he's interested in the watershed corridor." She stepped back to let him in. "Willow Pine is the largest single parcel in that corridor." Mason took his hat off and set it on the hook by the door. Her father's hook, the one that had been empty for 2 months, and came inside and sat at the table with the directness of a man who understood that this was not a social call. "Tell me what you know," he said. She told him everything Hattie had said. She spread the property documents on the table between them, and he looked at them with his full attention, asking precise questions: the exact boundary of the water rights, the terms of the grazing permits, the recorded acreage on the deed. He read carefully. He did not speculate out loud until he'd finished reading, which she appreciated more than she could say. "He'll come to you," Mason said finally. "Directly. That's how these men work. They don't go around the owner, they go through them. Make you feel like you're being offered something generous." "I'm not selling." "I know that. But he doesn't know that yet, which means his first visit is going to be about making you uncertain." He looked at her steadily. "Don't let him make you uncertain." "I don't intend to." "I know you don't intend to. These men are good at what they do, Caroline. His whole job is to find the crack and work it." A pause. "What's the crack he's going to look for?" She understood what he was asking. She thought about it honestly because this was Mason and he'd asked directly and he deserved a direct answer. "He'll look at a woman running a ranch alone and assume the loneliness is the crack," she said. "Or the debt. Or both. Then he's going to be wrong on both counts," Mason said. And the certainty in his voice was so complete and so quiet that it landed in the room like something solid. "Because you're not alone." She looked at him across the table, the documents between them, the lamp burning low, his hat on her father's hook. "No," she said. "I reckon I'm not." Hale came to Willow Pine on Thursday morning. She saw him coming from the north fence. She was checking the post that Mason had reset, testing the stability after the rain, and she watched his horse come up the road with the measured patience of a man who was in no hurry because he was confident in where he was going. He was dressed better than the day before, she noticed. He'd made an effort. That told her something. She walked to meet him at the gate, which meant he had to stop at the gate, which meant she was controlling where this conversation happened. Her father had taught her that too. Whoever picks the ground, picks the terms. "Mrs. Mason." He smiled a practiced smile, warm without being false, which was more sophisticated than most. "My name is Decker Hale. I believe you may have heard I was in town." "I heard," she said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hale?" "I was hoping we might have a conversation." He looked past her toward the ranch, a long, appreciative look that was also an assessment. "This is a beautiful piece of land. I can see why your family has held it so long." "We hold it because we worked it," she said. "Not because it's beautiful. His smile adjusted, recalibrated, she thought. He was quick. Of course, I meant no disrespect. He brought his attention back to her. I represent a development group with interests in this region of Wyoming. We're exploring options for a corridor project infrastructure primarily, and this property sits in an area of significant interest to our clients. Significant interest, she said. You mean they want it? They're prepared to offer a very fair price. More than fair, Mrs. Mason. I think if you heard the number, you'd want to at least consider. I don't need to hear the number, she said. Willow Pine isn't for sale. He nodded slowly, as though this were an expected answer and not a final one. I understand, and I respect that completely. I'm not here to pressure you. I'd never dream of it. He reached into his coat and produced a card. I'm in town for at least 2 weeks. If you find yourself wanting to discuss options, any options at all, I'd be glad to sit down with you at your convenience. She looked at the card. She did not take it. I appreciate the visit, Mr. Hale, she said. But I can save you the trouble of waiting 2 weeks. My answer is going to be the same on the last day you're here as it is right now. Something moved behind his eyes just for a second, just a flash of something that wasn't the warm professional smile. Then it was gone, and the smile was back, more careful now. Well, he said, I certainly admire your clarity. He tipped his hat. Good morning, Mrs. Mason. He rode back toward town, and she stood at the gate and watched him go, and felt with a certainty that settled in her bones that this was not over. Men like Hale didn't ride 4 miles on a polished horse for a 5-minute conversation they expected to end in a firm no. He'd come to look, to measure, to find the thing she wasn't saying. She went inside and wrote Mason a note and sent it with the ranch hand who made the Wednesday supply run. Hale came today. He'll be back. Mason's reply came back within the hour. I know. I'll be there Friday. He was there Thursday instead. She didn't question it. She poured coffee, and they sat at the table, and she told him the conversation word for word, the way she'd have given a report, exact sequential, nothing added or removed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He didn't pressure you directly. No. He was careful. Polite. That's worse, Mason said. Direct pressure you can push back against. Politeness you can't not without looking unreasonable. His jaw tightened. He's going to come back, and the next time he'll know more about what angle to work. What angle does he have? He's going to find out about the loan structure. Mason looked at her steadily. He probably already knows. Men like him do their paperwork before they ride out. He knows about the note, he knows about the cosigner arrangement, and he is going to decide that a marriage of convenience is a weakness he can use. The word landed between them with more weight than either of them acknowledged. How? She said. By approaching us separately, trying to find a gap. Mason's voice was flat and certain. He'll try to get to me. Offer me something, money, a partnership arrangement, some kind of stake in whatever his development group is building. Bank on the idea that I've got less invested in keeping the ranch intact than you do. She looked at him. Do you? The question was honest, and she needed an honest answer, and she could see that he understood both of those things. No, he said. Simply, finally. I don't. Something settled in her chest. Not romantic, not soft. Something structural, like a load-bearing wall that had just been confirmed sound. All right, she said. Then we make sure he doesn't find a gap. Agreed. If he approaches you, I'll tell you immediately. And if he comes back here when you're not around, send word, I'll come. He held her gaze. Caroline, he's not going to get this ranch. I want you to hear that and believe it. She heard it. She believed it. Not because he'd promised her something easy, but because he'd said it the way he said everything that was true, without decoration, without performance, just the plain weight of a man who kept his word. Hale came back on Saturday. She was in the barn, working with Contrary. The calf had developed the habit of pressing its forehead against whoever was nearest and pushing, which was either affection or a dominance test. She hadn't determined which, when she heard a horse and came out to find Hale dismounting at the gate, this time, without the professional ease of his first visit. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent 2 days recalculating. "Mrs. Mason, I apologize for coming without notice. What can I do for you, Mr. Hale?" He came to the point faster this time, which told her the politeness had been a first visit strategy, and this was something else. "I've done some additional research on the property. I want to be transparent with you. My clients are prepared to significantly increase their offer. We're talking about a number that would retire your existing loan, cover your operating expenses for several years, and leave you with substantial capital to start fresh somewhere of your choosing." "Start fresh," she said. "You mean leave?" "I mean have options," he said smoothly. "Options that a woman in your position—" "What position is that?" He paused, recalibrated again. "A woman managing a significant operation alone. I only mean to say that the burden of that is considerable. I'm not managing it alone. Of course your husband, though I understand Mr. Mason maintains his own separate property." He said it carefully, watching her. "I imagine the two operations keep you both quite occupied independently." There it was. She saw it clearly. He'd done his research exactly as Mason had predicted. He knew the shape of their arrangement, or thought he did, and he was pressing on it. She looked at him without any change in her expression. "Mr. Hale, I'm going to save us both some time. Whatever you think you understand about my marriage, or my property, or my position, I'd encourage you to reconsider your assumptions. Willow Pine is not available. It will not become available. And the line of reasoning you're currently pursuing is not going to open a door that isn't there." He studied her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Mrs. Mason, I've worked with a great many property owners in situations similar to yours. The ones who hold out longest are often the ones who end up with the least favorable terms when they eventually do negotiate. I'd hate to see that happen to you." "That sounds like a warning," she said. "It's an observation." "Then observe this." She held his gaze. "My father built this ranch with 30 years of work, and I have kept it running with everything I have. No number you can write on a piece of paper is going to change what this land means to me. And no veiled suggestion about what happens to people who don't negotiate is going to make me afraid of you." The professional warmth dropped from his face entirely for one clear, unguarded second. What was underneath it was not angry. It was something colder than anger. The calculation of a man reassessing a problem he'd thought was simpler than it was. Then the warmth came back. "I see," he said. "Well, I'll leave you to your morning." He was gone before she'd finished turning back to the barn. She stood very still for a moment after the sound of his horse faded. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart was doing something faster than normal that she noted clinically and set aside. She had not backed down. She had not shown him anything he could use. But she also had not missed the calculation in his eyes, and it told her something that sat cold and certain in her stomach. Decker Hale had decided she was a problem to be solved, and he was going to go looking for the solution somewhere else. She had a very clear idea of where. She sent word to Mason before noon. He arrived within the hour faster than the distance should have allowed, which meant he'd been closer than his ranch, which meant he'd been watching the road. She didn't comment on that. She told him what had happened and watched his jaw set through the telling. "He knows about the arrangement," she said. "He mentioned your separate property. He's going to approach you. Let him. Robert, let him come." His voice was controlled, but underneath it was something she hadn't heard before, not anger exactly. The very still, very cold resolution of a man who has decided something and will not be moved from it. "I'll be very clear with him about where I stand. He's going to offer you money, or a stake in the project. He's going to try to make it sound like I'm the one holding you back from something. Caroline." He said her name the way you say something when you need someone to stop and listen. "Look at me." She looked at him. "There is nothing that man can offer me," he said, "that would make me do anything that hurts you or this ranch. Nothing." He held her gaze with that steady reading attention that she'd come to understand meant he was giving her the truest version of what he had. "Do you believe that?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had shown up at her fence line a week after her father's funeral and agreed to put his name on her debt, and had been riding out on Fridays ever since, and had added her name to his ledger, she believed it so completely she was almost frightened by how much. "Yes," she said. "Then let him come." Hale found Mason in town on Monday morning. Mason had been at the land registry office checking the survey records on the eastern boundary of his property, something he'd been meaning to do for months and had found a reason to do today in town visible. He was aware it was a calculated visibility. He was fine with that. He heard Hale's voice before he saw him. "Mr. Mason, I was hoping I might run into you." Mason turned. He looked at the man. Took him in fully, the way he assessed everything, the quality of the clothes, the practiced ease of the posture, the specific kind of confidence that came from a long string of successful manipulations. He didn't offer his hand. "Mr. Hale," he said, "you know who I am." Hale smiled. "I suppose your wife mentioned my visit." "She did. Then you know I'm here on behalf of a development group with significant interest in the watershed corridor." Hale fell into step beside him as Mason started walking smoothly, presumptuously, as though he'd been invited. "I want to be honest with you man to man. The Willow Pine property is central to what my clients are trying to build. It's not optional for them." "Then they're going to be disappointed," Mason said. "Mr. Mason, I think there's room for a conversation here that might be in your interest specifically." Hale lowered his voice slightly. "I understand the current arrangement between you and Mrs. Mason is somewhat unusual. A marriage of convenience has a certain shelf life. When the loan is paid, the legal necessity dissolves. At that point, you'd be walking away from a significant commitment with nothing to show for it." Mason stopped walking. He turned and looked at Hale with an expression that was completely flat and completely attentive. The kind of expression that made men who were used to reading faces suddenly uncertain about what they were reading. "Say that again," Mason said quietly. Hale blinked, recovered. "I'm simply suggesting that your long-term interests and Mrs. Mason's may not be as aligned as you're suggesting," Mason said, still in that same quiet voice, "that my wife and I have different interests, and that you've figured out what mine are." He looked at Hale for a moment. "You haven't. Mr. Mason, you rode out to her ranch and called her position on her own land a burden." Mason's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You implied that her marriage was a weakness. You came to me expecting to find a gap." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "There isn't one." Hale's smile had gone careful. "I didn't mean any offense. She's not alone." Mason held Hale's gaze with the full, unblinking attention of a man who had nothing to prove and knew it. "She was never alone, and whatever your clients need to build, they're going to need to find another piece of ground to build it on. Because Willow Pine is not available. That's not going to change." A long silence. "I see," Hale said. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was left was the bare calculation underneath, and it was looking at Mason the way it had looked at Caroline reading Measuring Storing. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Mason said. He turned and walked into the land registry office and closed the door. He stood inside for a moment, hands still looking at nothing in particular. He had said she was not alone. He had said she was never alone. He had meant every word of it, and the meaning of it had not escaped him, what it implied, what it admitted, how far it was from anything two adults with a legal arrangement and separate homes should have been able to say with that kind of certainty. He hadn't hesitated. That told him something he had been circling for weeks. Caroline heard what happened in town from Hattie Grayson by Tuesday morning. Hattie had apparently witnessed the exchange from across the street and had described it to 3 people by evening, so by Tuesday it had become one of those Ridgeback stories that gets repeated with slight additions each time. But she wanted to hear it from him. He came on Tuesday, not Friday. She was at the fence checking the east gate when she saw him coming, and she walked to meet him at the road. "Hattie told me you ran into Hale," she said. "I reckon half the town saw it. She said you told him there wasn't a gap." She looked at him steadily. She said you said I wasn't alone. He met her eyes without flinching. That's what I said. Did you mean it? The question was not a test. She was not testing him. She was asking because she needed to know, not the legal answer, not the arranged marriage answer, but the real one, the one that lived underneath the practical terms they'd both been so careful about. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Yes, he said. I meant it. She nodded. She looked at the east gate for a moment, then back at him. He's not done, she said. Men like him don't stop at 2 attempts. No, Mason agreed. He's recalculating. What does he have left to try? He'll go after the land records. Look for something he can use legally, a dispute in the survey lines, a gap in the water rights documentation. Anything he can bring to a county judge to complicate the title. Mason's voice was level and certain. He's going to make this harder before it gets easier. She felt the weight of that land on her. Not the physical weight of acres and fence lines, but the emotional weight of everything her father had built and everything she was fighting to keep. 30 years of work. Every fence post her father had driven. Every entry in his careful slanted handwriting. I won't let him take it, she said. Neither will I. They looked at each other across the gate in the thin afternoon light, and something passed between them that was not said aloud, but was as clear and as present as anything that had been an agreement that was not about a banknote, or a legal document, or a necessary transaction between 2 practical adults. It was something else. Something neither of them had planned on all those weeks ago, when she'd ridden up to his fence line with her hands folded over her father's deed, and a problem she needed solved. Hale made his 3rd move on Thursday. He didn't come to the ranch. He went to the county clerk's office and filed a formal inquiry into the water rights survey on the Willow Pine western boundary. A survey in question, technically the kind that could sit in a county file for months without ever becoming a legal challenge, but the kind that also in the hands of the right lawyer in the right court could cloud a title enough to complicate a loan extension. Caroline found out from the clerk himself, Tom Weller, who had known her father for 20 years, and who came out to Willow Pine personally on Thursday evening to tell her hat in hand that he'd been required to accept the inquiry filing, but had made sure the original survey documentation was pulled and noted in the same file. He can file all the inquiries he wants, Weller said, but your father's water rights are documented clean back to 1871. There's no gap in that record, Caroline. Not one. Thank you, Tom. She held herself very still. Does he know that? He will by tomorrow morning when the clerk's notes go into the file. Weller paused. This man knows what he's doing. He's not going to win on the records. Your father was too careful for that. But he's going to make noise. That's what they do. Make enough noise that it looks like there's something to dispute, even when there isn't. After Weller left, she sat at her father's desk and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed. Then she reached for paper and wrote 2 words and sent the note east. Come tomorrow. Mason was at Willow Pine before 7 the next morning. He read the inquiry filing that Weller had left her a copy of, and his face went through something controlled and precise, the same expression it had when he'd seen her bruised arm multiplied. He filed it knowing it won't hold, Mason said. This is harassment. He's trying to run your costs up, legal fees, time stress, until you decide selling is easier than fighting. He doesn't know who he's dealing with, she said. No, Mason said, and looked up at her with that steady gaze that had stopped being merely reassuring and had become something she carried with her between his visits. He doesn't. They sat at the table together and went through every document her father had ever filed. Every deed notation, every water rights renewal, every grazing permit, every survey update. Mason read with meticulous attention, and she watched him read and understood in that quiet kitchen on that Friday morning that this man had stopped being a cosigner on her loans somewhere around the 3rd week and had become something she didn't entirely have a word for yet, something she was beginning to think she might need. At noon, she made sandwiches and they ate standing at the counter, side by side, documents spread across the table, and she thought, 3 months ago I didn't know his first name. The thought made her chest ache in a way she was no longer trying to explain away. "The records are clean," Mason said, setting down the last document. "Weller's right. There's no legal challenge that holds." "Then what does he do next?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "He applies pressure in a different direction." His voice was careful. "He's going to find a way to get to you socially, through the community. Make people uncertain about the stability of the property, the loan, the ownership situation. If he can make the right people in Ridgeback start asking questions, that creates its own kind of pressure." "Reputation," she said. "Reputation," he confirmed. She thought about Coates at the dry goods counter, about the 2 camps in Ridgeback and the gossip about the convenience marriage, about all the small ways a town could make a woman's position feel precarious without anyone technically doing anything wrong. She thought about Mason in the street saying she was not alone. "Then we don't give him anything to work with," she said. "We show them exactly what this is." "What is it?" he said, quietly. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was very still. It was the closest either of them had come to saying it directly, and both of them felt it, the held breath of the moment. The word just below the surface of everything they'd been building toward for weeks. She didn't say it. Not yet. "A ranch that isn't going anywhere," she said, "and 2 people who are going to make sure of that." Something moved in his face, something careful and certain and warmer than she was ready for. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." He stayed until late afternoon, helping her sort the documents into proper order and drafting a formal response letter to the county clerk's office that she could file the following week. He wrote it in plain, exact language that left nothing open to interpretation, and she read it twice and changed 2 words, and he agreed with both changes. And then they looked at each other over the finished letter, and she felt something she recognized from the rainy evening and the fence rail and every Friday that had become the marker she measured her weeks against. She felt certain. Not about the land, not about the legal outcome, about him. When he left, the late sun was flat and golden across the pasture, and Contrary was making noise from the barn in its perpetual campaign for attention. Mason paused at the hitching post and looked back at her standing in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Hale's going to make another move," he said. "Soon. Whatever it is, it's going to be bigger than the filing." "I know." "When it happens, I'll send word." She met his eyes. "And you'll come." He looked at her for one long moment. "I'll always come," he said. He rode east into the late light, and she stood in the doorway and watched until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she stayed a moment longer anyway. In Ridgeback. Decker Hale sat in his room at Hattie's boarding house and looked at the map he'd pinned to the wall, the watershed corridor laid out in clean lines. Willow Pine sitting square in the middle of it, like a hand pressed flat against a door. He had underestimated the woman. He had underestimated the husband. He had filed the inquiry and gotten clean documentation in return, and the whole town was watching now, which was not the kind of attention that helped his work. He looked at the map for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his bag, and walked downstairs and wrote a letter to his clients in Denver. The direct approach has met resistance. Considering alternative strategy. In the morning, he asked around town about who held the grazing permit agreements for the Eastern Ridge. He had not stopped. He had simply changed direction. And the thing that Decker Hale did not understand, the thing that his careful research and his practiced patience and his maps of watershed corridors had not told him, was that between the woman at the ranch and the man 4 miles east of it, there was no longer any gap to find. There hadn't been for weeks. He just hadn't been told yet. The letter from Denver arrived on a Tuesday. It came through the county clerk's office, formal legal stamped with the seal of a law firm Caroline had never heard of, but recognized immediately for what it was. Money and distance, the 2 things that made legal threats feel inevitable. She stood at Weller's counter and read it twice, and kept her face exactly as still as she needed to keep it, which took more effort than she would have admitted. The letter alleged a surveying discrepancy on the western boundary of Willow Pine, specifically a 40-acre section that Hale's clients claimed had been incorrectly recorded in the original 1871 land grant. They were not claiming ownership yet. They were requesting a formal resurvey at county expense, which would take months, which would freeze any loan modifications or property transfers during that time, which was the entire point. It's a stall tactic. Weller told her, his voice low and troubled. They're not going to win the resurvey. Your father's documentation is too clean. But while the process runs, your hands are tied on anything that touches the western boundary, and that boundary runs right through your primary water access. How long does a resurvey take? 6 months if the county moves fast, a year if they don't. She folded the letter. Thank you, Tom. She walked out. She got in the wagon. She drove 2 blocks and stopped and sat in the middle of Ridgeback's main street with the letter in her lap, and let herself feel for exactly 60 seconds the full weight of what was happening, the deliberate, engineered unfairness of it, the way a man with enough money and enough patience could make the law itself into a weapon against someone who had done nothing wrong. 60 seconds. She counted them. Then she picked up the reins and drove east. Mason read the letter standing at his kitchen counter. He read it once, set it down, picked it up, read the 3rd paragraph again. His jaw was doing the thing. It did the controlled tightening that she'd learned to read as the surface expression of something much larger underneath. He went to Denver, Mason said. He went to Denver, filed through a law firm so it looks like a legitimate property dispute instead of harassment. It is harassment. He set the letter down precisely. It's legal harassment, which is the most expensive kind. He looked at her. You need a lawyer. I know. There's a man in Cheyenne, Harrison Price. He handled a boundary dispute for a man named Aldrich 3 years ago, similar circumstances. Won it in 4 months. Mason was already moving toward his desk. I'll write to him today. Robert? She stopped him with his name the way he sometimes stopped her. He turned. This is going to cost money I don't have right now. I have it. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not asking. His voice was steady and final. I'm offering. There's a difference. He held her gaze. Let me help you. She looked at him across the room and felt the familiar pull, the one she'd been managing for weeks, the one that said accepting help from this man meant accepting something larger than help, something that crossed the line she'd drawn the day they'd signed those papers in Reverend Albright's parlor. All right, she said, quietly. Thank you. He wrote to Price that afternoon. She sat at his kitchen table while he wrote. The first time she'd been in his house, she realized which felt significant in a way she filed away without examining. His kitchen was plain and clean and had the particular order of a man who lived alone and had made his peace with it, everything in a logical place. Nothing decorative. The kind of neatness that isn't warmth, but is its own form of discipline. There was one framed thing on the wall, a land survey map she recognized as the topography of the Eastern Ridge. He'd hung a map. She found that for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, one of the most telling things she'd ever learned about him. You're looking at the map, he said without turning from the desk. I'm looking at your kitchen. It's not much. It's honest, she said. I like honest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he finished the letter and sealed it and set it on the corner of the desk to go with the Morning Post. What neither of them said in that quiet kitchen with the survey map on the wall and the letter sitting sealed between them was what they were both acutely aware of, that in the weeks since Decker Hale had arrived in Ridgeback, something had accelerated between them. Not the warmth that had been building since the water pump. Something else. The sense of alignment. Of two people who had stopped moving parallel and were now moving toward the same point. She was aware of it. She was also aware that she'd been here before. Not with Mason, but in the general territory of needing someone and letting herself need them, and she knew what it cost when the ground shifted. She drove home that evening and told herself she needed to be careful. She spent the next week being careful. She didn't send for Mason on Wednesday. She managed the Friday visit with deliberate practicality. They discussed the legal timeline, the resurvey process, the response letter Price had sent back within the week, agreeing to take the case. She kept the conversation in the territory of the practical and watched herself doing it and knew with uncomfortable clarity that she was rebuilding walls she'd spent months letting down. Mason noticed. She could see that he noticed. He didn't comment on it directly. He was not a man who pushed, but she could feel his attention shift the way it did when he was reading something carefully and had decided to wait before responding. The second week of her careful distance, he arrived on a Wednesday with a fence tool he'd borrowed 2 weeks earlier and set it on her porch and said, "I'll leave this here," and turned to go. "You don't have to leave," she said. "You've seemed like you wanted space." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't know what I want right now," she said, which was the truest thing she'd said in 2 weeks, and the effort of saying it surprised her with how much it cost. He turned back and looked at her with that full, careful attention. "Is it Hale the legal situation?" "Partly." "And the other part?" She looked at him standing on her porch in the early morning light, with her father's fence tool in his hand, and the survey map on his kitchen wall, and the 12 weeks of Fridays behind them, and everything she'd felt on that rainy evening when he'd told her the thing about her father, that she'd needed to hear from someone and hadn't known it. "I'm scared," she said. She said it plainly because there was no other way to say it that was honest. "Not of Hale, not of the legal situation. I'm scared of—" She stopped. "Of what?" he said, gently, not pushing, just making space. "Of needing someone again." She held his gaze, even though it was difficult. "Of building something on a person and having it give way. I've had 2 things give way in the last 3 months. I don't know if I have a third in me." He stood very still. He set the fence tool down against the porch rail. He looked at her the way he looked at a survey map. Attentive, exact, unwilling to get it wrong. "I'm not going to give way," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know that I've had more reasons to leave this ranch in the last 12 weeks than I've had to stay, and I've stayed every time." He held her gaze. "That's not the behavior of a man who's planning to give way." She felt the words hit somewhere she'd been protecting for weeks. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "I'm not asking you to stop being scared," he said. "I'm asking you to let me stay anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." But the careful distance she'd been maintaining had done something she hadn't fully intended. It had given her time to think, which meant it had given her time to feel. Which meant that when she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee and watched him talk about the legal timeline, she felt everything she'd been keeping organized and bounded and safely on the other side of a careful line, pressing against that line, with a force she was running out of reasons to resist. She was still running out of reasons when the fire started. It was a Saturday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, and she was in the south pasture checking the water trough when she smelled it. Smoke, not the clean smoke of a chimney, but the sharp spreading smoke of something that was moving. She turned and saw it along the eastern fence line, dry grass, mid-autumn dead, and a fire running with the wind at a speed that stopped her blood cold. She didn't freeze. She had been raised by a man who told her the only thing you couldn't afford in a fire was hesitation. She ran for the barn, got the horse, got the water barrel mounted on the wagon bed, and was driving toward the fire line in under 3 minutes. The wind was against her. The grass was bone dry after 2 weeks without rain. The fire had 40 yards on her already, and it was moving toward the barn with a patience that felt almost deliberate, the way natural disasters feel deliberate when they're aimed at everything you love. She worked the near edge, pulling the water barrel hose and soaking the grass ahead of the fire's path, trying to create a break before it could close the distance to the structure. The smoke was thick, and the horse was frightened, and she was talking to it steadily under her breath. "Easy, easy, hold on easy," while her arms ached and her eyes watered and the heat at her back was real and growing. She did not think about Mason. She did not have room in her head for anything except the fire and the water and the ground between them. She heard hooves before she saw him. He came from the north road at a gallop, which meant he'd seen the smoke from distance, which meant he'd been close, which meant he'd been on the road toward her already. He pulled up, took the situation in one long sweep, and had his horse tied and the second water line working off the other side of the barrel before she'd said a word. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the work didn't say better. They moved along the fire line together, him on the north side, her on the south, coordinating through the logic of the situation itself, each of them reading what the other was doing, and adjusting without direction. The fire pushed, and they pushed back. It tried the north corner, and Mason was already there. It tried to jump the wagon track, and she had the water line ahead of it. It took 45 minutes. At the end of 45 minutes, the fire was out. The barn was standing. The south pasture fence was scorched in a 30-yard section, but intact. The east water trough was undamaged. She stood at the edge of the burned grass with her arms at her sides and her chest heaving and her eyes still streaming from the smoke, and she looked at what was left of the field, and she did not cry. She stood there and breathed, and did not cry. Mason came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked at the burned grass, and then at the barn, and then at her. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed until he was standing next to her, and she became aware of her own hands, which were trembling with the particular fine tremor of a body that has been running on adrenaline, and has just been told it can stop. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. He didn't say it was all right. He didn't say she was fine. He held her shaking hands between his steady ones, and he stood there, and that was all, and it was more than anything he could have said. She felt something break open inside her, not dramatically, not with sound. The way ice breaks in early spring, slowly, and then all at once, and what's underneath is not destruction, but water, which is the thing that was always there moving under the frozen surface all along. She did not pull her hands away. After a long time, long enough that the smoke had cleared, and the horse had settled, and Contrary was making indignant noise from the barn, she said, "How did you know? I was on the north road. Saw the smoke." A pause. "I've been taking the north road when I'm working the ridge pasture. It's not the fastest way." She understood what he was telling her. He'd been routing himself past her road for weeks. He'd been keeping her in his peripheral vision, the way you keep something that matters close enough to see. "Robert," she said. "Yes." "I need to tell you something." "All right." She looked down at their joined hands. His were calloused and certain and warm in a way she felt in her chest. "I've been pulling back," she said. "These last 2 weeks, I've been doing it deliberately." "I know. I was afraid. I know that too. I'm still afraid." She looked up at him. "But I'm more afraid of what I'd lose by staying afraid than I am of the thing I'm afraid of." He looked at her with that full reading attention. "Say that again," he said quietly. Slower. She almost laughed, that short, startled sound she made sometimes in his presence, the one that always seemed to catch him off guard in a way she found she loved. "I'm saying I don't want to keep pulling back," she said. "I'm saying I don't want the distance anymore." Something in his face changed, not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man. But it changed the way substantial things change completely, and without any possibility of going back. His hands tightened slightly around hers. "Then we won't have it," he said. They stood in the aftermath of the fire with the burnt smell of grass around them, and the barn standing solid behind them, and 12 weeks of careful distance collapsing in the quiet between two sentences. And she felt more certain than she had since the morning she'd driven to that bank with her father's deed, and her jaw set, and her eyes dry, and everything to lose. She was not losing anything. She understood in that moment, with the clarity of something that had been true for weeks, and was only now being named, gaining everything she had not known to want, when she'd signed her name on that marriage certificate with the same hand that had driven her father's grave marker into frozen ground. The next morning brought hail. She had almost expected it. The timing had the feeling of something designed the way Hale's moves always had the feeling of design. He came to the ranch at 9 in the morning to find her and Mason both there. Mason's horse at the hitching post, both of them at the burned fence section, assessing the damage and making notes on what needed replacing. Hale looked at the burned fence. He looked at Mason. He looked at Caroline. His face did something complicated and controlled. "Mrs. Mason, I heard about the fire. I wanted to make sure you were all right." "We're fine," she said. "Thank you for your concern." "That section of fence." He looked at the burned line. That's going to be significant work. We'll manage. Hale looked at Mason. Mr. Mason, I don't believe we've spoken since our conversation in town. We haven't, Mason said. He didn't look up from the fence assessment. I wonder if you might have given more thought to... No, Mason said. Hale paused. You didn't let me finish. I didn't need to. Mason set down his notes and looked at Hale directly. You're here because you thought a fire might have softened the ground. It hasn't. Hale's composure held, but only just. He looked at Caroline. The resurvey process is going to take time, Mrs. Mason. And during that time, with a damaged fence line and ongoing legal costs, Mr. Hale, she said his name with the specific quietness that ended conversations. You filed a legal challenge that you know will not succeed in order to run my costs up and wear my patients down. You showed up the morning after a fire to see if disaster had done what your legal maneuver couldn't. She held his eyes. I want you to hear me very clearly. There is nothing, not the resurvey, not the legal fees, not a fire, not 3 fires, that is going to make me sell this ranch. And there is nothing you can say to my husband that I haven't already heard and answered. She glanced at Mason. He was looking at her with that expression, the one that had stopped pretending to be only attentiveness. Now, she said, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property. Hale looked at them both for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the road without another word. Mason watched him go. Then he looked at her. You called me your husband, he said. You are my husband. On paper. She met his eyes. Robert, after yesterday, after 12 weeks, do you still think that's all it is? The question sat between them in the clear October morning. No smoke left in the air, the burned fence line behind them, and the barn standing ahead, and contrary, watching from the gate, with what appeared to be genuine interest in the outcome. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved. His eyes held hers with the full weight of a man who had been certain of something for weeks, and had been waiting patiently and without pressure for the moment when certainty could be spoken aloud. No, he said. I stopped thinking that a long time ago. She nodded. Something in her chest settled into place with the specific finality of a thing that has come home. Then stop saying on paper, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, the honest shape of a smile, real and rare and entirely his. Yes, ma'am, he said. They turned back to the fence. They worked through the morning in the easy, wordless rhythm that had developed between them over 12 weeks of Fridays and emergency pump repairs and rainy evenings and document reviews, and one fire fought side by side in smoke and heat and fear. The rhythm was the same as it had always been. The air between them was different. Lighter settled the particular ease of two people who have stopped pretending not to know what they know. Around noon she brought water, and they sat on the fence rail, the same position they'd taken on the east pasture fence weeks ago, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the land. Price wrote again, she said. He thinks the resurvey challenge will be dismissed within 90 days. The documentation is too clean. Good. He also said Hale's firm has handled 3 similar challenges in Colorado and lost all 3. They use it as a negotiating tactic, not a legal strategy. Hale knows he's not going to win in court. Then what is he doing? Mason was quiet for a moment. Hoping you'll run out of fight before the 90 days are up? He looked at her steadily. He's never dealt with someone like you. He's never dealt with someone like us, she said. Deliberately. He looked at her. She looked back. She felt the words sit between them, not heavy, not weighted with what it was admitting. Just true, just accurate. No, he said. He hasn't. What Hale didn't know, what he couldn't know from the maps in his room, and the legal filings, and the careful research into the loan structure of a convenience marriage, was that the thing he'd been trying to find a gap in had become something no gap could survive. Not because of legal documents, not because of a banknote or a reverend's words in a parlor. Because two people who had both learned to expect the ground to give had found in each other something that didn't. And Decker Hale, with all his patience and all his strategy, had spent 3 weeks trying to separate something that had already decided it wasn't going to be separated. He just hadn't been told yet. In Ridgeback, by the end of that week, the story of the fire had gone around twice. The version that stuck, the one that Hattie Grayson told, and that Weller confirmed, and that even Coates in the dry goods store did not contradict, was this. There was a fire at Willow Pine on a Saturday afternoon, and Robert Mason saw the smoke from the North Road, and rode hard, and the two of them put it out together, and the barn stood, and the ranch stood, and when Hale showed up the next morning, he left inside of 10 minutes. People in Ridgeback drew their own conclusions. Most of them drew the right one. The ones in the second camp, the smaller, more careful camp that had been watching since the 4th week, exchanged no words about it. They didn't need to. Some things didn't require commentary. Some things spoke clearly enough on their own. Hale came to Hattie's boarding house that evening and packed his bags. He didn't tell Hattie he was leaving. She found out when she went to make up the room the next morning, and found the bed neat and the key on the dresser and a note that said, only, "Thank you for your hospitality." She went downstairs and told the first person she saw, which happened to be the clerk from the land registry office, who told Weller who sent a note to Willow Pine by noon. Caroline read the note at her kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the desk and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the south pasture, the part that had burned where the new growth would come in spring, when the ground had rested and was ready to give back what the fire had taken. She heard hooves on the road. She didn't move from the window. She heard boots on the porch and a knock that was neither hesitant nor demanding the knock she'd been hearing for 12 weeks and had stopped needing to think about, to recognize. "Come in," she said. "It's open." Mason came in. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her at the window. "Weller sent you a note too," she said. "Yes." "He's gone." "Yes." She turned from the window. She looked at Mason standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and the survey map on the wall of his own kitchen, 4 miles east, and 12 weeks of Fridays between them, and one fire, and one letter, and one moment on a burned fence line when she'd finally stopped rebuilding walls she was tired of maintaining. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. When I rode up to your fence line 3 months ago with my father's deed and a problem I needed solved, I thought I knew exactly what I was doing." She held his gaze. "I was wrong." He looked at her steadily, waiting. "I thought I was making a practical decision," she said. "I thought I was solving a legal problem with a legal solution. I thought I was keeping it simple." She paused. None of that is what happened. His hands were still at his sides. His face was doing that thing, open and careful, and carrying everything at once. "What happened?" he said quietly. She looked at him. This man. This specific, inconvenient, extraordinarily decent man who had shown up at every moment that counted without being asked and without making a performance of it, who had held her shaking hands in the aftermath of a fire and called it nothing, and called her not alone, and meant both things completely. "I don't know yet what to call it," she said honestly. "But I know it's real. And I know I'm not afraid of it anymore." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had stood in since her father died, full of everything that had been building for 12 weeks and had now finally quietly been given its proper name. Mason crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up to hold his eyes, and he looked at her with everything he was, all the steadiness and the patience and the dry humor, and the way he added her name to his ledger, and the way he'd been taking the North Road home for weeks, and he said, "I know what to call it." She waited. He reached up and tucked a strand of smoke-darkened hair back from her face very carefully, with the specific gentleness of a man who is handling something he considers important. "Mine," he said simply, "if you'll have it." She felt those words settle in her chest with the permanence of something that had finally arrived where it was always going. "Yes," she said, "I'll have it." Outside, the October wind moved through the brown grass of the south pasture, the part that had burned and would come back in spring. "Always comes back," her father used to say. Land that's been tested always comes back stronger. Inside in the kitchen of the ranch her father had built, and she had kept and fought for and refused to surrender. Caroline James looked at the man she had married for legal necessity and understood with absolute certainty that necessity had nothing to do with it anymore. It hadn't for a long time. Hale had been gone 4 days when the second letter from Denver arrived. Caroline found it on the counter at the post office on a Wednesday morning, and she recognized the law firm's seal immediately. The same firm, the same stamp, the same deliberate weight of paper that said money was behind it. She stood at Weller's counter and opened it and read it once without moving. It was not a retreat. It was an escalation. Hale's clients had filed a formal title challenge in the Wyoming Territorial Court. Not a resurvey request this time, but a direct legal claim asserting that the original 1871 land grant for Willow Pine had been improperly recorded due to a clerical error in the boundary description, and that 43 acres of the western section had never been legally transferred to her father at all. They were claiming those acres had remained federal land, and that their development group had filed a valid homestead claim on that federal land the previous month. She read it a second time. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, thanked Weller for his help before he'd offered any, and walked out. She did not go to Mason first. That surprised her 2 months ago. It would not have surprised her. But now that they had named what they were to each other and the distance was gone and he took the North Road home on purpose, her first instinct had become him, and she noticed the deviation. She went to Price first. She telegraphed Cheyenne from the post office and had a response within 2 hours. Come as soon as you can. Bring everything. Or she went home. She pulled every document her father had ever filed the original grant. The survey records, the water rights, the annual renewals, the tax receipts going back to 1871, and she stacked them in the order Price would need and tied them with the twine her father kept in the bottom left drawer of the desk. His handwriting was on the label of every folder. She ran her finger across it once. Once was enough. Then she sent word to Mason. He arrived in under an hour. She handed him the letter. He read it standing in the doorway, and she watched his face go through the controlled, precise sequence she knew now. First reading, second reading, jaw, stillness, decision. It's fabricated, he said. I know. The clerical error claim your father renewed those boundary records in 1878. I saw the documentation when we went through everything. The description was corrected and refiled and signed by the territorial surveyor himself. Price needs to see it. When are you going to Cheyenne? Thursday morning. I'm coming with you. She looked at him. She had expected this, had known it before she sent word, had known it before she read the letter the second time, but hearing it said plainly still did something to her that she couldn't make routine, no matter how many times it happened. All right, she said. They left before dawn on Thursday, the wagon loaded with documentation, and both of them quiet, in the way they were quiet when something serious was in front of them. Not the old careful distance, but the focused silence of two people who had decided to be in the same direction and were. Price was a small, precise man who reminded Caroline of her father's ledgers. Everything organized, nothing wasted. He spread their documents across his office table and spent 40 minutes reading without speaking. And Caroline and Mason sat across from him and waited, and did not fill the silence with anxiety the way anxious people did. Finally, Price looked up. This is a fraud case, he said flatly. Not a title dispute, a fraud case. Explain, Mason said. The homestead claim they filed last month, the one they're using as the basis for this challenge, was filed on a parcel that was already recorded as private land in the territorial registry. Either Hale's clients didn't do their research, which I doubt, or they found someone in the federal land office to record a claim on land they knew was already titled. He tapped the 1878 survey refiling. This document alone kills their clerical error argument. The boundary was corrected, resurveyed, and countersigned by a territorial official. There is no ambiguity. He looked at Caroline. What I need to determine is whether their homestead filing was fraudulent from the start. How long will that take? If I can get access to the federal land office records in Cheyenne, and I can, I have contacts there. I can have an answer within 2 weeks. If the filing was fraudulent, this doesn't just dismiss their challenge. It opens them to federal prosecution. Caroline felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet. Something colder and more certain. The specific sensation of a fight you've been losing on one front, suddenly revealing a second front where you have the advantage. Do it, she said. Mrs. Mason, this gets significantly more expensive. Do it, Mason said. Price looked at them both. Then he nodded and began making notes, and that was that. They drove back to Ridgeback in the late afternoon, the sky going orange and cold above the ridge, and Caroline sat beside Mason in the wagon with the documents in her lap and felt the shift that had happened in Price's office still settling through her. If it was fraudulent from the start, she said. Then Hale knew, Mason said. He knew when he rode up to your gate the first time. He wasn't trying to buy Willow Pine because his clients wanted the corridor. He was trying to buy it because they'd already filed a fraudulent claim on part of it, and buying it from you was cheaper than defending that claim in federal court. She sat with that for a moment. He came here knowing he was going to defraud me if I didn't sell. Yes. And when I didn't sell, he escalated. Yes. She looked at the road ahead. He underestimated what he'd find here. Yes, Mason said, and the word was simple and complete and carried everything she needed to hear. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, but it was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who have said enough, who understand each other well enough. Now that the quiet between them is not empty, but full. Full of 12 weeks, and a fire, and a kitchen table, and a fence rail, and a man who had written her name in his ledger before he knew what it meant. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest and the most ordinary of the entire 5 months. Strange because the legal situation was in Price's hands, and there was nothing to do but wait. And waiting after sustained combat has its own particular quality. The held breath, the 2 quiet days. Ordinary. Because Mason came on Fridays, and on some Wednesdays, and on at least one Tuesday that wasn't explained by any particular necessity, and they worked the ranch and ate supper, and talked about the cattle and the hay contract and the spring fence repairs. And the thing between them was not dramatic, and was not announced, and was more real for both of those reasons. He stayed for supper on a Friday in the 2nd week of waiting, and after supper he helped clear the table again, still without being asked, still without ceremony. And when they were done, she made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table, not with documents between them, but with nothing between them, which was different, which meant something. "Tell me about Ohio," she said. He looked at her over his tea. "What about it? You told me about your grandfather's land. You've never told me about why you left." A pause. She waited. She'd learned to wait for him the way she'd learned to wait for everything that was worth having, patiently without pressure, trusting that when it came, it would be honest. "My wife died," he said. 4 years before I came here. She and the child together, it was a difficult birth. He said it with the quietness of a man who has said a thing so many times inside himself that the words have been worn smooth. After that, I stayed 2 more years because I thought I was supposed to. Then I understood I was staying because leaving felt like abandoning something. And then I understood that what I was actually doing was keeping myself in a place where I couldn't be anything except what I'd lost. He looked at his hands. So I left. She looked at him across the table. She felt the weight of what he'd said, not just the loss, but the intelligence of the decision to go, the willingness to do the hard thing instead of the familiar thing. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife. About the child." "Long time ago now." "It doesn't have to be long ago to be worth being sorry about." He looked at her. Something in his face was open in a way she had not seen before, not raw, not wounded, just open. "No," he said quietly. "You're right. It doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why you live the way you do separately?" Quietly. "Partly." He turned the teacup in his hands. "Partly it's just my nature. I've never needed much noise." A pause. "And partly, I stopped trusting myself to hold things right. After. I was afraid I'd hold too tight or not tight enough, and either way, I'd damage something I meant to take care of. She heard what he was really saying, not about Ohio, but about now. About her. About the careful patience of a man who had been terrified of getting this wrong and had shown up every Friday anyway. "Robert," she said. "Yes. You've been holding things right." She held his gaze. "Since the very beginning. You've been holding things exactly right." His jaw moved. His eyes stayed on hers. "You'd tell me if I wasn't," he said. Not a question. "Immediately," she said. "You know I would." The corner of his mouth moved that honest, rare shape that she'd catalogued since the second week. "Yes," he said. "I do know that." They stayed at that table longer than they'd intended, and when he finally left, it was past 9 and the moon was up, and he stood at the door with his hat and looked at her in the lamplight with that reading expression that had stopped needing to read anything because it already knew what was there. "Caroline," he said. "Yes." "I want to ask you something." She waited. "When this is over, when Price has settled it, and the legal situation is resolved, and there's no more emergency to respond to." He paused. "I want to know if you'd consider making this permanent." She looked at him. "It is permanent. I mean officially, intentionally." His voice was steady, but she could hear the care underneath it, the specific care of a man who has chosen his words exactly and means all of them. Not because a bank required it, not because you needed a co-signer, because we've decided to. He held her gaze. "I'd like to stop being your husband on paper and start being your husband because we both chose it." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire was low. The moon was up outside. She looked at this man, this specific, serious, extraordinary man who had agreed to help a stranger and stayed because he wanted to, who had ridden in the rain to finish a conversation, who had held her shaking hands after a fire and written her name in his ledger and been taking the North Road home for weeks without saying so. And she felt the answer in her chest before she said it solid and settled and entirely without fear. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He exhaled just slightly. Just enough to tell her he'd been holding something. His hand came up and he touched her face once carefully, the way he'd tucked her hair back in October, with the specific gentleness of someone handling something important. "Good," he said. She laughed that short, startled, genuine sound. "Good," she said. "That's all you've got." "I've got more," he said. "But I reckon it'll keep." She was still smiling when he went out into the moonlit night, and she stood at the door and listened to his horse carry him east, and then stood there a moment longer, because she wanted to, because she could, because there was no reason anymore to pretend she didn't want to. Price's findings arrived on a Monday morning 17 days after their meeting in Cheyenne, and they arrived not as a letter, but as a telegraph, which told her before she read the words that something had moved faster than expected. She read it at the post office counter, while Weller watched her face. Homestead filing fraudulent. Stop Federal Land Office records. Confirm parcel already titled. Stop filing. Agent suspended. Pending investigation. Stop territorial challenge. Dismissed with prejudice. Stop hail firm notified. Stop further documentation to follow. Stop price. She read it twice. Then she set it on the counter and pressed both palms flat on the surface and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the specific, profound relief of a thing that has been threatening to fall, finally being made secure. "Good news," Weller said. "Very good news, Tom." She opened her eyes. "Very good news." She sent a boy with a note to Mason's property before she'd been home 20 minutes. He was at Willow Pine within the hour. She handed him the telegraph and watched him read it, standing in her doorway, and watched his face do the quiet, controlled thing, and then watched it do something else. Something she hadn't seen before. Something underneath the controlled thing that was simpler and warmer and more his than anything she'd cataloged so far. Relief. Just relief. The kind that's personal. "Dismissed with prejudice," he said. "Meaning they can't refile." "Meaning it's over." He looked up at her. "It's over, Caroline. She heard those words land in the kitchen and felt them settle into the walls of the house her father had built into the desk with his handwriting on the folders into the ledger, with her smaller compressed entries running alongside his careful ones into the survey map that was on Mason's wall, and the name in his ledger, and every Friday that had become the spine of her week. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in. She made coffee. They sat at the table and read the telegraph again together and talked about what came next, the formal dismissal document, the response to the law firm, the notation to be filed with the county clerk, recording the resolution. Practical things, necessary things, the kind of things you do when the emergency is over and you're building what comes after. But underneath all of it, running through the practical conversation like water through rock, was the other thing. The thing he'd asked her in the doorway 3 weeks ago. The thing she'd answered. The thing that was now not a question anymore, but a fact, waiting to be made official. "Reverend Albright," she said in the middle of a sentence about the county filing. Mason looked at her. "What about him?" "He's going to think we've lost our minds. We walked into his parlor and got married without ever having held hands. He already thinks we've lost our minds." She felt the laugh come up before she could manage it. Not the short, startled one, but a real one, full and surprised, and she heard Mason's version of it alongside hers, which was quieter, but entirely genuine, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table of Willow Pine Ranch on a Monday morning in November, laughing at Reverend Albright's probable expression. And it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing that had happened in 5 months of extraordinary things. When it settled, she looked at him across the table. He looked back. "Soon," she said. "Whenever you want." "Soon," she said. "I don't want to wait." He nodded. His expression was the settled, certain one, the one that had nothing left to prove and no performance to give. Just him. Just honest. "Neither do I," he said. They went to Reverend Albright on a Thursday. Albright did in fact look at them with an expression that suggested he was reassembling his understanding of the situation in real time. He listened to what they were asking. Not a new ceremony, not a legal filing. They were already legally married, but a renewal, a choosing, a standing in front of someone who knew them and saying, "This is real, this is chosen, this is what we intend." And his expression moved through several stages before arriving at something that was surprised and moved in equal measure. "You want to renew your vows," he said. "We want to say them for the first time," Caroline said. "The real ones." Albright looked at Mason. "And you, Robert?" "That's what I want," Mason said, simply, completely. Albright looked at them both for a long moment. Then he reached for his Bible. "Well then," he said, "let's do this right." It was just the three of them. No witnesses. This time they didn't need witnesses. This wasn't a legal act. It was a true one, which was different, which was in every way better. Albright read the words. The real words this time, not the functional contract language of the first ceremony, but the meaning underneath it, the promise to stay, the choice to remain, the declaration of something that had already been true for weeks and was now being given its proper form. Mason said his vows in the same low, unwavering voice he'd used the first time, but Caroline heard the difference. The first time had been careful. This time was certain. There was no careful left. There was only the true thing stated plainly by a man who meant every word with his whole self. She said hers clearly, precisely, with the fullness of a woman who knew exactly what she was promising because she had already been living it, and the words were not a beginning, but a naming. When it was done, Albright looked at Mason. "You may kiss your wife," he said, "and this time I mean it." Mason looked at her. She looked at him. And then he reached up and touched her face, that careful, specific gesture, and kissed her once with the unhurried certainty of a man who has all the time in the world because he knows where he's going to be. She felt it in her chest, like a door swinging fully open for the first time, light coming through from both sides. Albright cleared his throat softly. "Now that," he said, "is a proper ending to a story I was not entirely sure I understood." "Neither were we," Caroline said for a while. Albright smiled, a real one, the kind ministers wore when they'd seen something true. "Most of the good ones start that way," he said. The winter that settled over Ridgeback that year was cold and clean and exactly as hard as Wyoming winters were, which was very. Fences needed constant checking. Cattle needed moving. The barn roof in the north section developed a problem that took 3 days to solve, and 2 of those days were below freezing, and neither of them mentioned the cold because there was too much to do. They were both at Willow Pine through all of it, not the arrangement they'd agreed to in Reverend Albright's parlor 5 months ago. Not separate homes, separate lives, appearances when necessary. The real version. Mason moved what he needed to Willow Pine in early December, quiet and without ceremony, the way he did everything practically completely without making more of it than it was, or less of it than it deserved. His property east of town was kept running by a hired man he trusted, and he checked it twice a week. And the rest of the time, he was at the ranch that had become without anyone signing a document to say so his. He hung his hat on the hook by the door every evening, her father's hook. He did it the first time without thinking, and then noticed and looked at her to see if it mattered. "Leave it," she said. He left it. They ate breakfast together every morning and supper every evening, and worked through the middle of the day in the rhythm that had developed across 5 months of Fridays. No wasted motion, no unnecessary direction, each of them reading what the other needed before it was said. It was the most functional partnership she had ever been part of, and it was also the most loved she had felt since the morning her father used to laugh at his own jokes before he finished telling them. Those 2 things were not separate. That was the part she hadn't understood until now. Ridgeback adjusted its opinion on a rolling basis the way small towns do, not all at once, but gradually, each person updating their understanding as the evidence accumulated. The woman who had married a stranger out of desperation had become, by common acknowledgement, a woman who had married the right man, for reasons that were now obvious even to the people who had doubted her. Coates said something generous about Mason's work ethic in the feed store in January, which was as close to an apology as he was constitutionally capable of, and Caroline accepted it with equal grace. Hattie Grayson told the story of the fire to anyone who would listen, and the version she told had the accuracy of a woman who had been paying close attention since the beginning. The letter from Price confirming the formal dismissal arrived in January. It came with a note in Price's careful handwriting. The law firm representing Hale's clients has been referred to the federal prosecutor's office. I do not anticipate further action against Willow Pine. The property record is clean and will remain so. Caroline read it at the desk, her father's desk, and set it in the file with all the other documents, and closed the folder and put it in the bottom drawer. She sat for a moment with her hand on the desk surface. Her father's desk. Her entries in the ledger, now 12 months of them. Her handwriting getting less compressed and more settled as the year had gone on, as though her sense of the space she was allowed to take up had been gradually expanding. She opened the ledger to the current page. The most recent entry was from yesterday. A hay payment, a fence supply receipt, the fuel cost for the wagon. Ordinary. Complete. Every number accounted for every dollar, tracked with the honesty her father had taught her. She reached for her pen. On the line below yesterday's entry, she wrote the date. Then, in the column where she usually recorded the purpose of an expenditure, she wrote Willow Pine, Year 1. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the ledger and went to find Mason, who was in the barn doing something that was creating a sound of sustained complaint from Contrary, who had opinions about everything and shared them constantly. She came around the barn door and found Mason crouched beside the calf, full grown now, which meant Contrary was the size of a real problem, and behaved like one holding its head still with both hands, while it expressed its feelings about this situation at volume. "What did you do to it?" she said. "I tried to move it to the east stall. It objected." It always objects. "I'm beginning to understand why you named it what you did." She laughed and came over and put her hand on Contrary's flank and said, "Easy, easy, you impossible creature." And Contrary, as it always did when she spoke to it, settled immediately. Mason looked at the animal with an expression of profound personal offense. "It hates me specifically," he said. "It doesn't hate you. It's testing you. It's been testing me for 4 months. It takes a while." She looked at him. "It came around eventually." He looked at her steadily, Then the corner of his mouth moved, the real smile, the rare one entirely his. "Is there a lesson in that for me?" "There might be," she said. He stood and brushed his hands off and looked at her with that full, certain attention that she had stopped trying to be ready for, because it always hit the same way, regardless, like being looked at by someone who sees exactly what's there and has decided it's worth staying for. "Price's letter came," she said. "I know. I saw it on the desk. It's over, officially." "Yes." She looked at him in the January light, the barn, the difficult cattle. Her father's ranch in winter solid and standing, and hers theirs with the burned fence line in the south pasture, already showing the first pale suggestion of regrowth at the edges, the way burned land did when it had been given time and hadn't been asked to be anything before it was ready. "Robert," she said. "Yes?" "I want to tell you something I should have said earlier." He waited. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at waiting. "When I rode up to your fence line in October," she said, "I told you I knew exactly what I was asking. I told you I wasn't asking lightly." She held his gaze. "That was true. But what I didn't tell you, what I didn't know yet, was that I was also asking for something I didn't have the words for. Something I didn't know I needed." She paused. "You. Not a co-signer, not a name on a document. You." His jaw moved. His eyes stayed on her with the full weight of a man who has been waiting for something and is now receiving it. "I know," he said. "I think I knew before you did." "You probably did." "I definitely did." A pause. "I added your name to my ledger in November." She stared at him. "You what?" "Not as an account entry, just your name, on the back page." He looked at her steadily, not apologetic, just honest. "I didn't know what it meant at the time. I know now." She felt the words settle in her chest with the particular permanence of things that have always been true and have just been spoken aloud for the first time. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and put her hand flat on his chest and felt his heart beating under her palm, steady and unhurried and absolutely certain the way he was about everything that mattered. "What does it mean now?" she said. He put his hand over hers. He looked at her with no distance left in him at all. "That you're mine to take care of," he said, "and I'm yours, and neither of us has to carry anything alone again." She pressed her hand against his chest and felt the solid, irreversible truth of that. The truth that had been built across 5 months of Fridays, and emergency repairs, and rainy evenings, and one fire fought side by side, and one legal battle won together, and one name written in a ledger before either of them knew what it meant. Outside, the January wind moved through the winter pasture, and the horses were in the barn, and Contrary was making noise again, and Ridgeback was 4 miles west with all its adjusting opinions, and Hale was wherever men like Hale ended up, and Price's letter was in the bottom drawer with the clean, clear record of a property that had been fought for and held. Inside in the barn of Willow Pine Ranch, 2 people stood with their hands over each other's hearts in the middle of an ordinary January morning, and what had begun as a signature on a document, cold, necessary, carefully bounded, had become the truest thing either of them had ever chosen. Not because a bank required it. Not because a law demanded it. Not because desperation had left no other door open. Because 2 people who had both learned that the ground could give had found in each other something that didn't, and had chosen it every single day until choosing it became the same as breathing necessary, natural, and something neither of them could imagine doing without. Willow Pine stood. It would keep standing. And the marriage that was never meant to matter had become in the end the only thing that mattered at all. The thing they had both been building toward, without knowing it, from the very first moment she rode up to his fence line, with her father's deed in her hands, and everything to lose. She had lost nothing. She had gained everything. And Robert Mason, the silent, careful, extraordinary man who had agreed to help a stranger and discovered he had come home, looked at the woman beside him in the winter barn and understood with the complete and unshakable certainty of someone who has finally arrived where he was always going, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not on paper, not by arrangement, not by necessity, by choice. completely irrevocably and forever by choice.